it's approximately half and half, give or take, but referrals by child's gender, females 53%, sorry for the small writing at the back of the room there, but males 47%. And again, different data that was presented earlier would tend to link into that males and females of children are suffering from some form of abuse, or the referrals that are coming in are roughly split half and half. The perpetrators or the abusers that we see, very generally, approximately males 60% and females 40%. And quite often in different presentations and discussions with my partners, agency partners, is looking at international statistics and seeing whether the Cayman Islands is any different than internationally. And really we are not, aside from a few percentage either way. We're pretty much the same on par with what international statistics tell us. I talked about the referrals spiking or going up, and this is just a very simple graphic from 2015 to 2018. And these are statistics kept within the police and the MASH unit. That in 2015, these are child safeguarding referrals. We received 225. And if you recall that the children law was 2012, for instance, and safeguarding efforts really were not just started then, but changed and enhanced then. But the data that I was able to access from 2015 increased in 2016. But of significance, if you recall, March 2017, when we created the multi-agency safeguarding hub and started presenting and making sure that the media were aware of the referrals that needed to come in, and being a mandated reporter, ensuring that you do send in a report when you have a reasonable suspicion of abuse. And as a reminder, a referral is merely a request for service. It doesn't mean that the police are going to go out and make an arrest. It's a request for a service for that child or children that are made reference to in that report. Crucially then, that went up in, quite dramatically, 747 in 2018. And even now, towards the end of February, the monthly averages are up and above what we saw last year. So we're looking at close to maybe 1,000 referrals as a long-term projection for this year. What that means, just in stats terms, a 21% increase, an 80% increase, and a 52% increase, but significantly, just to show some dramatic effect, that's a 232% overall increase from 2015 to 2018. To put that in perspective, that's a positive. I regard that as a positive, that we are receiving the referrals, we are able to gauge the real problem. If we look at 225 as data, that didn't really give us the true picture about what was going on in Cayman. With the multi-agency safeguarding hub, with the agency partners that we have, with the Ministry, the Department of Education, enhancing their teachers' awareness of making referrals when a child presents themselves or discloses any issue with abuse, that those referrals are increasing. That does not mean there are more crimes happening against children. It just means that we are becoming more aware of them and therefore able to provide the appropriate services for those children, which I think is positive. Okay, so how does that affect children? I'm just checking one time. So. The effects that we see on children, of course, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a counsellor, I'm not a clinical, I'm not a doctor, I'm a police officer that looks at the practical aspects of the child presenting to us, and the team that we have in the family support unit who investigate and interview these children using our forensic interview methods called Achieving Best Evidence. We are looking at the effects and how we can enhance our own treatment of children when they come as victims, under our wing, as it were, to make sure that we're giving them the best chance possible to present the best possible evidence that we can then generate into court, into evidential presentations to the court. But the effect that we've got, and I'll explain what the butterfly means in a second for those of you who might already link it, but We've already heard from Dr. Lam about some of the effects of abuse in children, the bullying, the binging, the eating disorders even, escapism and substance abuse, and they are all very, very relevant. Of course, I don't want to repeat what the data has already said, and I was looking at the reactions from some people when that data was presented, and of course with some horror and some shock about what's actually happening in the Cayman Islands. And again, from a police perspective, we are seeing all these things happening. But the actual effect, or what I'm referring to as the butterfly effects, linking into the very basics of the chaos theory, really, that if we do not address the problem at an early age, if we do not address it as young as possible, with children presented to us with abuse, injuries, with mental health issues and challenges, if we don't address that early, there will be a butterfly effect, there will be a chaos theory effect, that going into adolescence, going into adulthood, they will continue to progress throughout that with those issues, and therefore potentially commit further crime because of the abuse that they've been receiving. So, we look very briefly at delinquency or desperation, as I've called it, or as I saw in some research, again, modern vernacular, called conduct disorder. And essentially, in our terminology, antisocial behaviour. Delinquency is very much a terminology from the 50s, I guess, from, we have the James Dean effect of being that juvenile delinquent. But delinquency is still in the terminology that's used today. But I looked at that and say, why do children misbehave? Why do they commit crime? And is it through the risk-taking behaviour or the desperation, the cry for attention, for instance? And if we look at children as in need of help rather than making sure we arrest them and correct their behaviour, long gone are the days where we put children in corrective institutions. And again, coming from the UK jurisdiction, we had prisons for children, we had youth offending prisons, and they didn't term them that, they were called detention centres, just to make them not sound what they were, but they were secure facilities where youth that committed crime were placed. And I certainly want to get away from that. Of course, in the Cayman Islands, with the amount of population we have, that is perfectly achievable. There was mention before of weapons, and again, I've heard a startled intake of breath in the room about weapons being taken, and it was a significant percentage of weapons. And that's come from the children themselves. Of course, that's data that really we, the police, haven't had access to before, so it's so interesting to hear that, because our information is based on the arrests that were made, based on the reports we get from teachers, and I can guarantee that that data is accurate, and with the advent of children protecting themselves, even using weapons as status symbols, taking predominantly knives into school. What is of significance, without repeating some of the data really, that some of this is also encouraged by adults as well, and encouraged by their own families. And we had a case just recently where, it was the uncle of a young child. This isn't just at our secondary schools, this is at our primary schools as well, where in order to protect themselves, they were armed with a knife. And unfortunately, on that occasion, the teacher intervened because the child, being a bit naive, was showing it to his friends, and of course somebody pointed it out to a teacher, and then it was dealt with. And of course, being a young age, under the age of 10, it didn't go down as a criminal offence, but there were definite red flags there that needed to be addressed. When we look at self-harm, that's been extensively covered in the previous slides as well, but self-harm and suicide particularly, everyone says, oh, it's just a cry for attention, but I think that's a very naive way of looking at it. Self-harm comes about through many, many facets to it. And what we've seen recently is not just self-harming, but publicising that self-harm as well, and circulating. We saw one case where a child had harmed himself on his arm, but was then posting it on social media because that was a modern thing to do, to share with his friends, look at me, look at what I'm doing. That wasn't, I guess, what we define as a suicidal ideation, but what must be going through that child's mind to self-harm themselves, but then to publicise it on social media. It has to be some form of cry for help. It has to be that child in some sort of desperation looking for some assistance. And of course, once we were aware of that issue, then obviously we engaged with the appropriate services. I'm just moving on, obviously, in the interest of time. One thing that's perhaps another elephant in the room, of course, is promiscuity and gang initiation as well. And promiscuity, particularly not just the physical activity, but I mentioned before about sharing sexual imagery and sexting, for instance. But as a result of that, then comes shaming and exposing, and these children, girls and boys, that are sharing images with each other as a way of, that's their modern way of, hey, do you like me? Look at my boobs, or look at other parts of my body. That's the modern way of children seems to be interacting with. Thankfully, not all children, but there's definitely, we're seeing an uptick in the number of inappropriate digital images that are being shared amongst children. And again, the schools are on the ball with this. They have methods in place in school to make sure that such sharing of imagery is being addressed. But also with the gang initiation as well, and the National Security Council that I understand have got a team together, or a group together, that are looking at gang initiations, or gangs in general in Cayman. And although that has been a taboo subject in the past, with whether it's a group or a gang, for instance, gangs in Cayman, I did my bachelor's study on this, gangs in Cayman, although they exist, they are completely different than the format of gangs in Central America, in America, and in the UK, for instance. I did the study of different regions. So although we have to accept we do have gangs, there are different nuances to the gangs that we have here due to the population density, etc. Just moving on then to police attention. What is the current movement in policing is about recognising the need for a healthcare setting, not a police station, as an appropriate environment to deal with children. And that's something that's promoted by recent acts of parliament in the UK, for instance, where children suffering mental health, it's actually illegal now to take them to a police station. They have to be taken to an appropriate healthcare facility, which I think is an amazing revolution in UK ideas of policing, but under the provisions of the Mental Health Act and some amendments, and maybe that will have a knock-on effect. Just looking for Dr Lockhart, whether the Mental Health Commission can look at that opportunity to link into the UK Mental Health Act provisions. And under the Police and Crime Act, it becomes an offence to put a child suffering from mental health in a police station. Also with police attention, of course, comes media attention, comes public attention. I think it's be remiss not to mention that negative media and attention and reports made in social media, online media, it actually does have a detrimental effect and an adverse effect on victims. And those professionals that deal with victims that have had social media shaming and exposing online, of which there's some very recently, that is very detrimental to the work that we do, and it's very detrimental to the work that a lot of you do in the room here. So again, that's not lost on us as the police, but we need a joined up approach as to how we deal with that with the media. On this final section, just a bit about the future, that really the studies that I've seen look at children, and we look at job prospects, we look at the fact that things done in youth, again, I joked about back in my day, I'm just lucky there wasn't social media back in my day. I think every presentation I've seen where adults are like, phew, I was born in 1968, there wasn't even any internet, we were lucky to have electricity in Manchester at that time. But the advent of social media, of course, has changed the dynamics of the world. And when we look at future prospects, every new employer is going to do an Instagram search, a Facebook search, a social media search, and even go beyond that and employ companies to do those background checks for them and do a deep dive into somebody's history. And of course, there's been some instances here, but definitely internationally, if you're looking for job prospects, then you're going to be under scrutiny. Within that as well, looking at my role, is that if you have a child abuse history as well, more significantly your future prospects, if it's not addressed and not you don't get assistance for that, you will then take that into adulthood as well. You will then take that, you'll be harbouring guilt, you'll harbour fear, and of course, retain that mental health unwellness into adulthood, and that will affect then all the decision making that you make, and whether that's a decision about which partner you have, linking into domestic violence, of course, and the cycle of domestic violence. Unless you break out of that guilt, fear, and mental illness or mental challenges, then you won't get the required assistance that you need. As a final point on the online media, if there's any young people in the room, of course, adults as well, I always like to apply the billboard test, as we call it. And the billboard test, if you imagine a big screen or a billboard behind me, who might see what you're posting online? What does it give away about you, and what impression of you does it give? And, you know, personally, in any of my social media postings, I'm also very mindful as a professional, as a police officer, to make sure that appropriate posts are made. Of course, I can't help what my friends, or so-called friends, post either about me or in connection with that, but I'm certainly very conscious of what I write today, because that, in 2 years' time, when I go for the Commissioner of Police job, for instance, I'm only saying that because that's a joke, by the way. Okay, I must move on, but the butterfly effect hopefully has some resonance with you in that if we don't address early, it is going to cause problems down the line. And using the chaos theory as an example may be a bit extreme, but I do really think that that's significant to this. I just want to put some very quick international perspective on the discussion today. In the research that I was looking at across the world, and it's maybe a test of your geography as well, it was of mine, that there's the Cayman Islands in blue. I looked at studies in Canada, in Sweden, South Africa, Canada again, the Netherlands and the USA, just as some comparison to see mental health issues, how child sexual abuse particularly, or child abuse in general, how has it affected the rest of the world as well, and how I can use that in my policing to make sure that we look after the children of today. In Quebec, Canada, the study showed that child sexual abuse is associated with adverse outcomes, including heightened vulnerability that may translate into risk of re-victimization. And that's what we're finding, that word re-victimization, that unless the child breaks out of that cycle, they are subjected to re-victimization as well. Furthermore, maternal support may buffer the risk of developing mental health distress, suggesting that intervention programs for victimized youth may profit by fostering parent involvement. And that's a study done in 2016. That is of significance. I'm a father, so my paternal support, I challenge this, going, oh, hang on, I can just do as good, but I think it's generally accepted that maternal support, and studies and empirical research shows that fostering parent involvement in everything that we do is significant in our child's development, and I wholeheartedly support that. In America, child maltreatment is associated with increased odds of mental disorders among males particularly, and larger effects were noted for males who experience child sexual abuse particularly. And these results are important for understanding the significant long-term effects of child sexual abuse among males. And I look at that in my role, again, a fairly recent study in 2017 there, I look at that in my role as domestic violence investigation unit as well as the child safeguarding investigation unit, that males that are committing sexual offences, looking at their background, looking at their motivation, how did this happen, looking at it from a criminologist's point of view, not maybe to obviously stop that offence that's already happened, but stop any future offending, and making males particularly realise that they need as much help as anybody in addressing maybe some of the things that happen to them, some tragic things that happen to them, very traumatic things that happen to them in their youth. And what we are seeing with the increase in referrals is actually an increase in some historic referrals being made into the police and into the MASH unit, which is good to see, because it means that people are coming forward now and addressing that fear, that elephant in the room in their own mind, and making sure that they address it personally as well. In South Africa, just particularly in relation to intimate partner violence, domestic violence, child abuse experiences of men exacerbate adult male perpetrated intimate partner violence. And child trauma is a risk factor for both poor mental health and male perpetrated intimate partner violence among men. Again, 2016 study. Just linking to two studies in Europe, in the Netherlands, the relationship between childhood abuse and both internalising and externalising mental health problems is of more salience for understanding sexual offending than non-sexual offending. And this was a study done on juvenile sex offenders, and so therefore it should be an important focus in the assessment and treatment of juveniles who sexually offend. That again, those professionals in the room that I don't profess to be one, but clinicians, doctors, therapists, etc. You know, these are the studies that assist your role, I guess, and that can drive that. But by the police understanding these things, we can assist you and support you in that. Over in Sweden, there was a study done on the type of offending against children, and parents are most likely to use physical aggression. We see that here in the Cayman Islands, and spanking and corporal punishment as a typical example. Whereas typically siblings perpetrated property crimes and partners committed sexual assaults. And I have to say that mirrors what happens here in the Cayman Islands as well. Peers were most likely to perpetrator of both physical and verbal victimisation, essentially bullying, and most often committed polyvictimisation by subjecting the youth to multiple forms of violence. And again, linking back to Dr. Lamb's presentation, I think that adequately addresses that thing as well about multiple forms of violence being used and bullying. And that's 2017. I want to leave on a positive note just with this side of the presentation, that having supportive parents and family relationships was significantly associated with good mental health, and that's in children as well as adults. Positive community and school experiences were also significantly associated with good mental health, and that is a very recent study done again in Canada, in Manitoba. And I've got all these references. If anybody wants to email me, I can supply them to you. But to me that, and I can see the Family Resource Centre all nodding their heads there, because we do a lot of good work with them. And I think that reinforces a lot of the work that we do, that fostering good parental and family involvement and maternal involvement particularly, it seems, has a positive effect on our children. So just moving on, as time gets short again, I just want to look at the police response to what we do, and I will have to do that because I know you're all probably desperate for lunch as well. The police response has a number of areas, and I'm linking into some of the training background that I have here as a recruit trainer and national trainer in the UK, looking at some paradigms of training and how we can apply that to modern policing as well. So I'm just going to very quickly run through these 6 areas. And you're probably thinking, KUSAB, what's that? And it was the same question that I asked when I was taught this. But KUSAB really is the knowledge, understanding and skills that police officers are taught. Of course, to apply the law, we have to have knowledge of the law, we have to understand the law, but also the application and timing of such interventions, making sure that we're making an arrest at the appropriate time, for instance. If you don't have knowledge, you're unconsciously incompetent, essentially, and by going through the knowledge, understanding and skills sections, you become consciously competent in what you are doing, and that's something that we're trying to make sure that all police officers are consciously competent in the efforts that we're doing to fight crime, to engage in law enforcement, and of course look at safeguarding as well. The skills, of course, are the kinesthetic skills, making sure that we do the appropriate things that we're doing, being aware of body positions and movements. But I just wanted to get onto the final 2, which is the attitude and behaviour, which is often missed, or was often missed from police training, but that I've advocated for a number of years since 2003 when I went into police training, of looking at the attitude and behaviour of police officers in not what we do, which is the knowledge, understanding of skills, but how we do it as well. There is a method of arresting somebody with dignity and with respect and positive policing values. Having an appropriate level of empathy is important. We need to be cathartic, we need to be catalytic and supporting and facilitative in our work. And that's as opposed to being prescriptive and confronting and too authoritative. A lot of police officers, and by mere definition of wearing a uniform, of course we are authoritative, and you often look for that uniform. Those who are at KABOO will have seen, you might have thought we engaged thousands of new police officers. They were all officers on shift and working, for instance. But we have to look at that, as I say, with a more cathartic approach. We should act in a criminal justice environment, but also in a healthcare capacity as well, or quite often in both. and that is to support, assist and respond where necessary and when required. The national decision model, as we call it, is just again a simple circular decision-making model, without going into it in too much detail. But this is evolved from a business model, in fact, and anybody who runs a business can perhaps assist or look at this to assist them. That having intelligence-focused information coming in drives our risk factors. We look at our threats. We look at the powers and policies that we have to enable that. Can we do the thing that we're intending to do? And of course, getting around to making the appropriate option, taking the appropriate action, looking at the considerations of the consequences of not doing something or the consequences of doing something, and then following that wheel around, as we call it, spinning that wheel of the national decision model. And that's how police essentially come to all their strategic decisions. In police training, we need to understand the challenges. Part of the CUSOC model is understanding what the problems that we face are, so therefore we can address them. We need to combat discrimination. I've put that because that doesn't mean the police are discriminatory at this stage. We have to be if people commit criminal offences. Of course, we go for the criminals and make sure we make the arrest. But combating discrimination and prejudice by definition, and making sure that we don't use our discrimination, especially with mental health patients, and making sure that we look at that. Promoting social inclusion, conflict resolution, and being trauma-informed. That's a method that I want to get more policing into, be trauma-informed and make sure our decision-making is appropriate in that. And recognising the early stages of mental health. Which then brings me to, hopefully, I'm just sneak on from that box, of engineering some change. That in order to allow these things to happen, we need to collaborate and cooperate. We need to consider that children have rights as well under the Convention of Rights for the Child, agree risk criteria with our agency partners, and share need-to-know information. We need to address the growing pains that we all have in working together, which inevitably will happen when different large agencies come together, but also have equality and inclusion in everything that we do. So just to conclude, the police aspirations really that I want to engender within the police is recognising those early warning signs, recognising those indicators, and teaching police officers how to address mental health particularly, improve the attitudes of behaviour. It doesn't mean it's particularly wrong at this stage, but we can always improve upon that. React appropriately to the situation we face at that present time, and also seek professional guidance and help, not hinder the situation. So although I had to, in the interest of time, just push on from things like that, I hope you found it informative and interesting. I'm willing to engage in anybody in any discussion. Kevin Ashworth at gov.ky, Mash at gov.ky is any information or referral information that you want. I'll be hanging around at lunch and for the rest of the presentations and linking to the next presentations. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Inspector Ashworth, for that very informative presentation. I think it's really good to know the RCIPS, the first responders in so many situations where there's a mental health issue, so it's nice to hear that there's an effort being made to train and facilitate their development in that area. So our next chapter is Chapter 3, Connecting the Dots, Childhood Trauma and Mental Health. And our speaker for this chapter is Dr. Colleen Brown. Dr. Brown is a licensed psychologist in the Cayman Islands, as well as in Pennsylvania in the United States of America. She specializes in working with youth with a variety of mental health issues and has received specialized training in severe mental illness and those who have experienced abuse, violence, or trauma. Dr. Brown has presented papers and guest lectured on a variety of topics, including child development, childhood trauma, behavioral techniques, and confidentiality issues. She has a strong interest in diversity and the impacts of culture on the individual. And since coming to the Cayman Islands, Dr. Brown has been with OnCourse Cayman, where she provides individual and group therapy, conducts psychological assessments for adults, adolescents, and children, and facilitates corporate workshops. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Colleen Brown, who's going to talk Chapter 3, Connecting the Dots.
discussed in both of the presentations today, so I'm going to try to fill in some gaps about that knowledge about trauma. I speak very fast, so if I am going too fast, please let me know, and I can slow down, but I'm trying to also be cautious of time as well, because I know we're entering lunchtime, and everybody's probably looking forward to eating lunch. Okay? Let me just check and see how this works. All right. Okay, so trauma can be broken down into two types. So there's simple trauma and there's complex trauma. Now part of the issue when you see this is you're going to see simple trauma and you're going to think simple. Not the case. Okay? Simple trauma basically means that the symptoms are easier to parse out. So this is kind of the trauma you think of when you think of PTSD. So there's usually one specific incident or several incidents that are very common to be used so that are identified as a major stressor. So, most of what I'm going to be talking about in the presentation today has to do with complex trauma, which is trauma that is prolonged and repeated over time. And what's important to know about this may not look like PTSD. And that's the important part, is because a lot of youth are showing up with these symptoms, and they don't look like PTSD or what you would picture of it. So, even though I am going to be focusing mostly on complex trauma, I do want to cover the type 1 simple trauma, just so in case you haven't been exposed to this before, you have an idea of what it looks like, okay? So the symptoms are most associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, and this is what people typically think of when you mention the word trauma. So one of the very common examples that I often give when I'm trying to give people an idea of what PTSD is because it's been seen in a lot of TV shows and movies, is the soldier returning from war, okay? Because that's been something that's commonly been shown in a lot of, episodes of, I think Grey's Anatomy actually even had this several years ago. So symptoms can include, usually in these categories, hyperarousal, which can include being easily startled, feeling tense, angry outbursts, okay? So an example of this could be, for example, let's say a car backfires, and then somebody puts their hands over their heads and ducks. That could be an example of something like this. Re-experiencing, flashbacks, nightmares, triggers. So maybe if someone attends a fireworks display, and then the smell of the smoke starts drifting to them, and then they start getting really erratic. That could be an example of something like this, and you're like, what's going on? But it's actually that the smell of smoke is reminding them of bombs, or something to that effect if they were a soldier. Avoiding people, places, things that may remind them of the trauma. And I'll give some examples of that later, actually, when we talk about complex trauma. And changes in mood and thinking. So irritability, anger, sadness, anxiety, different things like this. Okay. But this is what I really want to talk mostly in this presentation about, is complex trauma. And what is complex trauma? Complex trauma refers, and it comes from, these early adverse experiences or events. So what are some of them? Well, we talked about one earlier. We already talked about child maltreatment earlier today. So I want to just be clear that my definitions that are listed here are more clinical in perspective. Look at the children's law and consult with MASH from the more legal perspective of the laws, okay? But obviously physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect have a very, very stark impact on children. Okay. Now, some of the other things, because I think that when people talk about trauma, they often think of abuse. And not to say that it is not important, it is very important, and it is a huge component of trauma. However, people don't tend to think of these other things. So I want you to also think about these. Family violence and community violence.